Cyrene is a simulated March 7th. This is like my second, third, maybe even fourth video about Cyrene and March and their possible relationship with a varying degree of success. I mean, for the most part, I seem to get the main idea right, but it's more like the ending predictions that I get a little bit off. Or a lot off. Like, Cyrene was the demigod of time, just not in the cycle that we were in. It ended up actually being the Trailblazer. And I did predict that Amphorius was a simulation, the Titans were representing the eons, and everything had something to do with the Machine Emperor's War and the anti-life equation. But I was a bit off about the simulation being run by Remembrance instead of Destruction and Remembrance. Kind of. It's weird. And now in a full circle moment, I am now reevaluating one of my oldest theories about this topic that came out even before Amphorius came out. March 7th and Cyrene are the same person. Because the 3.4 story might have just shown that while I was not completely right, that I might not have been completely off either. So today we'll be going over everything we know about Cyrene's story, her and March 7th's deep connection with the Remembrance, and why Cyrene might just be a simulated March 7th. But before that, if you like these types of theory and explanation videos, let me know by liking and subscribing. And as always, leave your own thoughts and theories in the comments below. With all that being said, let's get right into it. Let's start by understanding Cyrene's story, as this story quest is the first time we actually get to learn about who she is and what her motivations are. Cyrene was born in Ides Elysiae and was a childhood friend of Finon. She was talented with stargazing and divination, and was said to be the local priestess of time. It was confirmed that Ides Elysiae is a village that mainly worships the Titan Ornyx. It's also implied that Cyrene is a bit older than Finon, as she was the one who did Finon's original divination reading when he was a kid and picked out the Deliverer card. Finon and Cyrene were the only two children to have been welcomed by the fairies of the Remembrance Maze. It was said that only those pure of heart may enter, but I personally think that it had more to do with Cyrene and Finon setting up to be the demigods of time and deliverance respectively. On the note of the fairies, or mems, they definitely have a tie with Ornyx, and maybe even a direct connection to Fuli themselves. I mean, by name alone, Remembrance Maze is literally 2 letters away from Remembrance. There's also a very interesting thing that Dolly Mem mentions when the Black Tide attacks Ides Elysiae, that the Remembrance Maze is the only place safe from the Black Tide, and it is a place that the gods abandoned. And this is why I think the fairies have a tie to Fuli, as the only way the Black Tide wouldn't be able to affect the Remembrance Maze is if it's separated from the influence of the Titans and thus the simulation. And considering that Mem, while yes is Cyrene, and thus has the blessing of Ornyx and Fuli, was able to recreate past environments purely on story and memories alone, even before the MC became a demigod, it's reasonable to believe that a village of similar type of creatures that are tied to the Remembrance might have been able to separate themselves via freezing an environment's time. And this tie to Fuli may be the reason why Cyrene, who has been gazed upon by Fuli after dying in the recent cycle, was able to be reborn as a Mem, a creature that is linked to the Remembrance, and took shelter with Ornyx, the Titan who worships Fuli. Now, Cyrene and Finon were both Chrysos heirs. The original plan was to set off on a small training journey to hone their craft. Finon would go to Castrum Kremnos to study the sword, and Cyrene would train in Yanasopolis, both eventually coming back home to protect Ides Elysiae. But unfortunately, the Black Tide did the classic Hoyo thing of making them orphans. And that's not even the most tragic part of their story. After surviving the Black Tide's rampage, Finon and Cyrene left to go to Amphorius' mainland. Cyrene went to study at Yanasopolis, becoming a student at Ornyx's temple. She reunited with Finon when he was sent to Dual Mide at the Scales of Talantin, after which Aglaia recruited the both of them to join the Flame Chase as Chrysos heirs. Nearing the end of the Flame Chase, the Black Tide was about to take over Amphorius, and Finon and Cyrene noticed that the Black Tide had taken the form of something like a broken teleslate, and noticed that the voices of the Titans had been coming from the Black Tide the entire time. Finally realizing that Amphorius is a simulation and they're just data, not real people, which by the way is a wild thing to realize before you're about to try to save the world. They still intend to take in the Final Core Flames and bring in Era Nova. At the Vortex of Genesis, they confront Lygus, who basically reveals everything to them, pushing them to complete Era Nova, as this would complete Iron Tomb and the rebirth of a Lord Ravager that would destroy the Era erudition. Cyrene noticed a fallacy in his statements though, that there could be other eons that are already paying attention to Amphorius, and as such could bring in possibilities outside of destruction. And then they do the one thing that no other character in Honkai Star Rail has ever done: not tell their plan to the enemy. They then slay Lygus and enact their plan to weave a long dream for Amphorius, a constant loop of the final flame chase. And as Fuli records the time on Amphorius, if the time in Amphorius is looping without moving forward, it would force Fuli's attention on Amphorius, and Cyrene specifically, as she is the one looping the time. Using the power of the remembrance given by the gaze of Fuli, Cyrene imbued that power into her ceremonial blade and gives it to Finon so that he can continue the cycles. But to ensure that time disappears in Amphorius, Cyrene would have to die in every cycle to ensure that the flame chase could never be completed. Finon would have to explain to her in the beginning of every cycle what happens, then she would have to imbue her blade with the power of remembrance and die to Finon's sword to ensure that time will never move forward. And these cycles, which are different from the cycles that are previously occurring on Amphorius, is the eternal recurrence, the cycle of the final flame chase, until a real person arrives and brings in change to Amphorius, which took 33,550,336 cycles. On that cycle, the Trailblazer was able to take the mantle of time in Cyrene's place, changing the loop of Amphorius. This, along with the gaze of Fuli, allowed Cyrene to appear as Mem and grant the Trailblazer the power of time and remembrance that would have normally been hers. At the end of the 33,550,336 cycle, Finon entrusts the duties of the Deliverer to the Trailblazer, and Mem/Cyrene of that cycle becomes part of the Trailblazer, ensuring that the Trailblazer will still carry the power of time to the final cycle. In that final cycle, the Trailblazer will need to go on one last flame chase journey, but now as the Deliverer, and this time with Cyrene at their side. Now, a quick note about the eternal recurrence: it's actually based on an ancient Greek philosophical belief that all things at the end of the world will loop back to the beginning, exactly the same as it was, and all of time is cyclical. In modern times, this concept was used by Friedrich Nietzsche, who used that concept primarily as a thought experiment to challenge individuals to live a life worthy of that repetition. A big part of his central belief is amori fati, the love of one's fate, this acceptance of everything, including suffering, as an integral part of life's repetition, which may actually play into Finon's views and motivations, that through all of the repetitions and cycles, his suffering and struggles is worthy of fates and will ultimately have meaning. Hoyo, along with a lot of other games like Persona, tend to really like using Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophies in their games, most likely because his topics cover stuff like freedom, fate, and what it means to live a good life in a meaningless world. It was actually quite an interesting topic to cover when I was in my philosophy classes in college. Now, while Finon was going through these cycles, Cyrene apparently just ended up in the path space post her getting killed each cycle, and the fact that she's here might just actually speak to her deep connection to Fuli, which brings me to the next subject: Cyrene and March 7th's tie to the Remembrance. One interesting thing that Cyrene mentions is that in her childhood, she had a dream where Fuli appeared behind Orynyx. This on its own may be considered a gaze from Fuli, as all the examples of Eon's gazes we've seen is while the person is unconscious. This one moment would have blessed Cyrene with some abilities from the Path of Remembrance, and may explain her talent in divination and why she ends up in the path space instead of dying. That gaze she gained as a child, or even the gaze she gained in order to create the eternal recurrence, separated her from Amphorius due to that tie to Fuli. But as a being of pure data, she doesn't really have a physical body, nor a mimetic one, so the only place to go is the path space, or back to Amphorius, which seems to be where she is in the last cycle. Now, Cyrene's ability to erase memories of all of Amphorius and loop its cycles may or may not be equivalent to that of an emanator, as she would essentially be looping the memories of a confirmed emanator, Iron Tomb. There could be an argument made that Black Swan did something similar in Penacony, but at the same time, that was a world made from Memoria, and she herself fell for Enna's dream, and could only awaken those of strong will. So these gazes that Fuli has bestowed on Cyrene may have actually opened up the powers of the path to her, especially since she is now in the path space, the home of the paths. In terms of March 7th, well, I made like 3 different videos about the various different things that connect March to the Remembrance, and at the very least, least those parts of the videos held up pretty well. So I'll link those videos below so you can see how wrong I was. They go into this a little bit more in detail, but I'll still briefly cover some of those points because they do connect with some things that 3.4 mentioned. March has always been speculated to have a deep tie to the Remembrance, as her 6-phase ice is made from Memoria and is structured to look like Fuli. On top of that, she has always had a natural talent for dreamweaving, which is basically Memoria manipulation, the token skill of the Memo Keepers. Her tie to the Remembrance was completely confirmed way back in 1.3, when Fu Xuan was trying to help her regain her memories, but was ultimately stopped by a Memo Keeper, and even mentions that her past is an illusion and to focus on her future, which literally makes no sense. This is the exact opposite of everything Memo Keepers stand for. Black Swan mentions that the Garden of Recollection's base philosophy is that the present doesn't exist, that past is memories and the future will just become the past. So for a Memo Keeper to basically just go against their own philosophy, there has to be a reason. There is the possibility that the Memo Keeper was a Memo Snatcher that has the special permission from the Garden, or maybe one of those factions that Black Swan mentions that took March's memories in order to understand Amphorius and just lied to March. But here's the question. Why wouldn't they let March see her past before, but push her to see it now? I think this might actually have to do with something as simple as time and place. During March and Cyrene's stay in the path space, the Memo Keepers keep repeating the same line, save the Garden. And now it is 100% confirmed that March has a tie to Amphorius, as her voice responds to being called Mother from Orynyx in the As I've Written entry.
Don't be scared. Please don't be afraid.
So there is something about March entering Amphorius and assuming regaining her memories that will save the Garden. And that is why when March was originally trying to access her memories, the Memo Keepers wouldn't allow her to receive them because she was in the Xianzhou, not Amphorius, not the right place. As for the time, it's actually quite simple. This is the final cycle. Iron Tomb is about to awaken, and they know that Cyrene and Final has been looping the cycles, but that can't last forever. They need to act. Because if Iron Tomb awakens, yes, it will destroy the erudition, but since it's also being made from the anti-life equation, which is a memory-based virus, it would also do a lot of damage to the Remembrance and maybe even destroy the Garden as well, literally killing 2 birds with 1 stone. So what about March makes her the hero that the Garden needs? Well, it's probably because she might just be the emanator of Remembrance. This theory has been around since forever. I and pretty much every other HSR theorist have made a video about this. I mean, a being that the Titan of Time would refer to as Mother should probably be at least that level. March has also always had this somewhat joking belief that she was an ice princess in the past. It's been mentioned both in 1.3 and all the way in 3.4, and even her new skin literally looks like an ice princess, tiara and all. And Fuli is designed after a Chinese emperor. So allegorically, if an Eon is the emperor, what would the princess be? The most likely answer would be an emanator. And 3.4 even furthers this by calling March and Cyrene children of Remembrance, literally the princess to the emperor. This can't just imply that they're Pathstriders of Remembrance. It has to be deeper than that because every one of those Memo Keepers that call them that are Pathstriders. And this also disproves the theory that March was the literal child of Fuli prior to their ascension, as March and Cyrene were called children of Remembrance. But Cyrene is literal data. She can't be the biological child of any living being. And the way it was said by the Memo Keepers places both March and Cyrene on equal levels of reverence. So that just leaves one possibility, that they are both emanators of Remembrance. Now, you may be thinking, well, Jordan, if this is true and they're both separate emanators, wouldn't this prove your theory wrong, as they can't be the same person? Well, yes and no. Because I never said in this theory that Cyrene and March were the same person. Although Cyrene does mention in the game that her and March look alike, which yes, could be a joke comment, but this is also Hoyo, and they love putting the biggest lore in the tiniest comments. But my theory, remember, isn't that they are the same person, but rather Cyrene is a simulated version of March 7th. To explain this, we have to go over a fairly fairly small detail in the data logs that was given at the end of the 3.4 story quest. The Titans, their divine domains, and the Chrysos heirs were emulations of the Eons, paths, and Pathstriders. Now, I'm currently working on a separate video about that topic alone, so check that out when that comes out, most likely next week. But for now, this is important information to know, because based off of this comparison, demigods should be mirroring emanators, people that resonate with the divine domain of a god due to the path they follow. And if the simulation went through the trouble of replicating actual paths onto their 12 factors / titans, then it would make sense that the scepter may have actually used real emanators as the base data when creating the demigods of each titan. As they say in Star Rail, Pathstriders are as plentiful as the stars. So they can't replicate exact data about Pathstriders onto the Chrysos heirs, it would be too many. But emanators? They are few and far between. Each Eon only has a handful of known emanators at a time. Nanook only has 7 and Sheepbay seems to only have 4. And from what we can see, it doesn't seem like emanators can die of old age. So there are definitely data profiles of a lot of known emanators of each of the paths throughout the history of the universe, even the ones that may be dead. Maybe not all of them, but definitely a good amount of them. And since the scepter was once connected to Nous as a neuron, and the fact that Lygus is still able to get information throughout the universe, data logs about emanators from all of the paths should be fairly easy to get. So what I think happened is that the scepter got data of March's original self, the emanator of Remembrance. Then it created a data profile based on March's true form. And since Orynyx, the Titan of Time, is the Titan associated with Remembrance, it would make sense that the scepter would create Cyrene as the demigod of time based off the data profile about the original March 7th. This would also explain why Cyrene and March only resemble each other, rather than look exactly like one another. Cyrene was made based on a foundational data that the scepter had, which may not have had every single detail about March. And they also had to ensure that Cyrene matched the already existing environment and evolution of Amphorius. As to which data point made Cyrene so short, well, even I can't speculate on that one. So yes, they aren't the same person, since Cyrene is essentially what March may have been in Amphorius based off whatever data the scepter had. And for that reason, Cyrene can be a separate emanator as well. Now, as a final note to this theory, there's a few interesting observations I've made about Amphorius emulating paths. And it's the fact that since the simulation created the Titans and its people based off of Pathstriders and Eons, then those people and Titans following those paths could technically become Pathstriders on their own. And this may actually be the reason why Orynyx calls March Mother. If March is an emanator of Remembrance and Orynyx calls Fully Sky Father, then calling March Mother may be a similar term of reference to a higher being, but not one as divine as Fully. Although there may be other reasons, as there was an old theory that March was the 13th Titan that came from the beliefs of the numerophiles. They proposed that there was a 13th Titan who was an unknowable god that would grant the world chaos from which order would emerge, and the 12 Titans are illusions created by that natural structure. Now, it's more likely that that was a reference to Lygus, the Scepter, Iron Tomb, or even Nanook, since they were technically the ones who created the Titans. But like I said, there was once a theory that March was the 13th Titan, because the literal mother of the Titans. And for her to regain her memories via traveling to Amphorius, she would have to have a tie to this place somehow. But really, all the pieces are already here, so where does she fit if not the 13th Titan? Again, I'm personally not really too sold on this idea, but I would like to share with you and see what you guys think. And that's the theory for today. If you made it this far in the video, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate that. And as always, let me know your own thoughts and theories in the comments below. With all that being said, peace.